Without you, this symposium wouldn't be possible. I'd like to thank the panel speakers and artists who are participating and presenting research topics and precious works around the themes of the Asian diaspora and migration narratives. This symposium is particularly meaningful to us as the year of 2023 remarks the 60th anniversary of diplomatic relations between Canada and Korea, as well as the 10th anniversary of Korean Film Festival Canada. I would also like to emphasize that this symposium is organized by the second generation of our nonprofit organization, Arts East West, which was founded in 1996. So it has taken nearly 27 years to shift from first generation organizer to second generation, which is still in process. This symposium showcases our culture and started to run from January 27th to February 25th. During this month, various events involving the participation of about 40 to 60 individuals will draw large number of public participations. The geographical map of our invited speakers include artists, scholars, and researchers in the cultural and arts fields from South Korea in the east and across Canada in the west. This symposium was motivated by anti-hatred incidents and a long history of systemic discrimination in our society. Such incidents are deeply rooted and have become more visible around the world, but especially in North America since the COVID-19 pandemic broke out several years ago. Our goal with this symposium is to listen and share stories of people for a better understanding of our neighboring communities and the members of the Asian diaspora. Most of the content of the symposium has come out of our bi-weekly Asian Diaspora Book Club meeting. We believe in arts and artistic acts, which can be the best and most accurate language and tools to affect and leverage fixed boundaries, such as our rigid perceptions or stony preconceptions about race, colonized customs, and fixed geographic notions. We'd like to shift and decolonize some of these bit by bit. No one owns anyone. Borrowing a thought from Gilles Deleuze in A Thousand Plateaus, any kind of ownership must be dismissed, as we can't claim one's locus on the horizon. Deleuze's notion has become accelerated in our digital world as everything turns into a nomadic culture that dismisses any boundaries. In short, we hope that this symposium will be an entrance to creating and proliferating open discussions, revisiting the issues of Asian diaspora and migration narratives, all considering basic questions that come up in our everydayness. Who lives next door? Who are my neighbors? And what cultural histories or personal stories I can share with them, or can they share with me? Essentially, what concerns us here is how to open a conversation with those in our proximity. To begin, our first panel today will provide us with a historical and contextual background of the Asian diaspora and much more. I'm so honored to present Madame Livia Monnet, Professor of Comparative Literature, Film and Asian Studies at the Université Montréal. Her research interests encompass East Asian literatures, cinemas, visual culture, environmental arts, and her research areas are eco-criticism, feminist and queer fiction, decolonial studies, critical indigenous studies, and Asian diasporas. Her recent publications include Toxic Immanence, Decolonizing Nuclear Legacies and Futures, and works on Chinese contemporary artist Lu Yang in Screen Bodies. Please welcome Madame Monnet with a big round of applause, or feel free to write a short welcoming remark in our chat space. Thank you. Here, Livia Monnet.
Thank you, everyone, for organizing this wonderful panel and the symposium that will follow. It's a very, very important initiative, and I welcome it. I think it is really relevant and timely. So I would like to thank, first of all, Mi-Jeong, all the collaborators, Zach Fuentes and everyone in the AAPLab, and also our panelists. So I will start by introducing the panelists, and then we'll ask the three of them to speak about their experiences, about their research, their artistic activities and films, and how they see Asian diasporas and what has happened in recent years with anti-Asian hatred, and as Mi-Jeong said, which is also aggravated by the pandemic, by the COVID pandemic.
Thank you, Mi-Jeong, and all the organizers for having me here. I'm so delighted to meet everyone. Let me start. So today I'd like to share some historical narratives of Zainichi, or Korean residents of Japan. As Dr. Monnet kindly introduced, well, first of all, I'm not a historian who specializes in Zainichi history, but today I wanted to add some perspective to the diaspora experiences of Zainichi community, and more broadly, Asian diaspora, by bringing colonialism into the picture. I think it'll be helpful or useful to talk about myself first, to explain how I became drawn to the stories of Zainichi. I was born and raised in South Korea, and the country is, I believe some of you may know that, it's a country where national identity is not questioned enough. If you're born with the Korean citizenship, just like the 97% of the population of Korea. And coming to the United States to study in the PhD program, and also settling down here now in Vancouver Island in Canada over the past 10-something years, it allowed me to finally raise a question regarding my relationship with this abstract concept called nation, the term that I have been trying to historicize and also deconstruct as a historian, but hardly occurred to me as a subject to reflect upon in my personal life. It finally became a problematic category as my life as a migrant has moved forward. So this is where I became so intrigued by the historical experience of Zainichi Koreans in Japan. Of course, I know I shouldn't be too excited about using their narratives merely as a source of academic inspiration. And I believe that's kind of psychopathic detachment from historical narratives, which ends up reducing the stories of human sufferings merely into an object, which is the last thing I would want to do as a scholar. But rather the historical experience of Zainichi people who have been occupying such a liminal space between imperial citizens and stateless refugees, between Korea and Japan, between even two Koreas, North and South Korea, and lastly, between insiders and outsiders, allowed me to reorient the question of identity. That is to say, liminality not as an exception, but as an essential human condition that becomes pronounced only when one transgresses or pushed to transgress borders, whether it means physical border or cultural borders. So here, let me briefly explain about the historical experience of Zainichi. I think I should go back to the first page to talk about the name itself. So Korean residents in Japan are normally called Zainichi, which literally means present in Japan or being in Japan. The literal meaning, which is presence, can be very misleading because of their continued vulnerable status in terms of citizenship, their ethnic identity. Although ethnic Korean residents have been present throughout the 20th century and beyond, they have been treated like a permanent others, both by Japan and by two Koreas. And in view of this, it is fair to say that Zainichi people have been simultaneously present and absent. Then how did Zainichi Koreans end up in Japan? The history goes back to the colonial period, as many of you know. And then the fall of the empire back in 1945. And during the colonial period, Koreans moved to the Japanese mainland either voluntarily or involuntarily. And before the war, the Asia-Pacific War, many Korean farmers lost their land because of the land expropriation policy under the Japanese rule. And many Koreans migrate to Japan as cheap laborers, for example, at construction sites. And in addition to that, those who had sufficient capitals or political status to afford education came to Japan to receive higher education. During the wartime period, the number of Korean residents drastically increased because of this forceful mobilization of Koreans as wartime factory workers or mine workers, and also as military servicemen. And when it comes to their origin, more than 90% came from the southern part of Korea, where extreme poverty prevailed during the colonial period. Then what happened to this Korean diaspora after the collapse of the empire? There were over 140,000 Koreans who went back to their home country after its liberation from Japan. On the other hand, there were another group of people who decided to remain in Japan even after the liberation. There are people who formed an ethnic, these are the people who formed an ethnic minority group in Japan called Zainichi Koreans, or simply Zainichi, in the post-war period. Then a question arises, why did these ethnic Koreans continue living in Japan even after the liberation of Korea from the Japanese Empire? This is related to the post-war or post-liberation circumstance in Korea. So some people chose to stay in Japan for multiple reasons. The poor economic condition in their home country, in particular, the lack of housing and jobs deterred them from going back. And more importantly, political instability and conflicts in the post-liberation period made them feel even harder to be repatriated. Especially people who were involved in the left-wing groups could be arrested or purged if they went back to South Korea. I mentioned earlier that 90% of them came from the southern part, not the northern part. And if they go back to their hometown, it was possible they could be purged under the circumstance. So some of the people who were repatriated to Korea initially fled back to Japan to avoid the red purge of South Korean government. Probably some of you may know about Jeju uprising between 1948 to 1949, and the violent suppression of civilians in Jeju under Syngman Rhee, at the time president. This became a major factor causing the residents fleeing to Japan. And in the post-war period, their status was redefined by the US occupying forces that occupied Japanese mainland until 1952. They were no longer imperial subjects of the Japanese Empire, of course, because there's no empire anymore, but they are now registered as aliens. This suggests that they remain stateless refugees because of the absence of the official government in both sides of Korea. And finally, in 1948, two separate governments were established, each side. In the South, Republic of Korea, and in the North, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. In addition to the stateless status, ethnic Koreans in Japan forced economic hardship because of the limited employment opportunities, racism, and prejudice against Korean residents. So majority of Koreans remained unemployed or became low-wage workers, and eventually engaged in some illegal activities such as black market, smuggling, and as you all know, pachinko. These unlawful images are still associated with Zainichi even today, which function as a racial stigma in Japanese society. And over time, there were some changes in the experience of Zainichi Koreans, and this is really, contextualized by the Cold War situation. So just as Korean Peninsula was divided along ideological lines, Zainichi Koreans were also divided largely into two groups. So South Korean affiliation group is called Mindan, that was established in 1948, and North Korean affiliation group is called Chongnyeon, that was established in 1955. And Korean War brought about this sharp division of Koreans along ideological lines. Interestingly, the two Koreas made different efforts to support ethnic Koreans in Japan. Between 1959 to 1984, North Korea at the time campaigned for the repatriation of Zainichi group in collaboration with the Japan Red Cross Society. And that resulted in the repatriation of over 90,000 ethnic Koreans to North Korea, even if they are not originally from North Korea. And not surprisingly, these returnees were used as a tool for the state propaganda, and they returned to their ideological motherland only to find themselves in the midst of hardship and poverty. And in the meantime, South Korea normalized the diplomatic ties with Japan in 1965. And under this treaty between two countries, Zainichi Koreans who had remained as aliens by the time were now allowed to obtain the rights of permanent residence if they choose South Korean nationality. More than 50% of Zainichi obtained permanent residences by maintaining South Korean citizenship, and approximately 40% of people who support North Korea refused to obtain permanent resident status, and they still remain as aliens. And only a small number of Zainichi chose naturalization, and as of 2021, there are approximately 410,000 Korean residents in Japan currently who maintain their Korean nationality while staying in Japan as a permanent residence. Throughout the post-war period, Zainichi group have faced systemic and cultural discrimination, including ethnic discrimination in job and marriage opportunities, and so-called fingerprinting enforcement. This is very notorious in practice. And fingerprinting is a colonial tool for biosurveillance, as many of you know. And it was not until 1993 that the surveillance system was finally abolished. And although majority of Zainichi people obtained the status of permanent residents, they are not entitled to vote for general elections, and the lack of political rights they held prevents the changes in immigration systems from happening because their voices hardly fit into the policymaking process, especially the lack of support for the Korean schools and systemic disadvantages and discrimination against Korean schools and lack of welfare system for foreigners, including Koreans, such as pensions and health insurance, etc. And hate speech targeting Zainichi and anti-Korean protests are relatively a new phenomenon. There's a group called Saitokukai They have been protesting against the extension of suffrage and welfare programs to foreign nationals and especially Korean residents in Japan. And they have made racial inserts by calling Zainichi people as criminals and demanding them to leave the country, just like right-wing people or racist people in North America. I'd like to conclude my presentation with this concept liminality. Anthropologist Victor Turner, he said about liminality that liminal entities are neither here nor there. They are betwixt and between the positions assigned and arrayed by law, custom, convention, and ceremonial. Zainichi Koreans' experiences of straddling between two nations or conversely being recognized nowhere as proper citizens or nationals push us to think against the naturalized sense of national belonging. Zainichi's narrative moving from the imperial subject to stateless refugees and then to being forced to choose nationality reveals to us a sort of regulatory fiction around inclusion and exclusion. In other words, the fiction of nation that put all of us somewhere between inclusion and exclusion. This is all from me. I'd like to hear your question and comments afterwards. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mi-Jeong, and the organizers for this international symposium for inviting me and providing me with the opportunity to think about where I am at with regard to my own practice as well as pedagogy. And I want to first acknowledge that I am calling in from Jujage as a racialized settler. And Jujage is located on the unceded ancestral territories of the Kanien'kehá:ka people, who are the original custodians of these lands and waters. And I'll self-describe for those who are listening in today. I speak to you from my home office in front of a virtual Zen background depicting practically nothing. And I am middle-aged, have black hair and Asian features, and I'm wearing a beige turtleneck sweater today. I was born in Montreal in Jujage, and my faculty office at Concordia is on the same street that I grew up on. My parents immigrated to Canada in 1967 for a better life, leaving tear gas riots in Hong Kong, which was a British colony until 1997, when it was returned to Chinese rule. As an Asian Canadian, Anglophone, visible minority, living in Canada's French-speaking province of Quebec, I am a racialized person on unceded Indigenous lands who every day mandatorily needs to grapple with what Quinn Mulet calls asymmetrical settler racial hegemonies and identifications. Now I wanted also to underscore how some of us are indeed living constantly, daily, under ongoing colonial conditions of that are legacies of colonialism and colonial rule. And we can think of certainly access to safe, palatable water, for example, for some Indigenous communities. But today, in fact, as an example of how deeply we are implicated in these kinds of racial hegemonies, and not just their presence, but in fact their potential violence, is how I'm going to share screen now, which is going to just take two minutes. Can you see my slideshow? Okay, great. So thank you. So I'm going to speak to my slides and just basically stop at the 14-minute mark. So some of you know, apart from being an art historian and cultural organizer, I'm also very invested in the practice of curating, and these are some of my favorite shows. An important publication for me in recent years has been the co-editorship of a special issue of Rakar, which was on what is curating, and to make up for the lack of contributions by BIPOC curators, for lack of time, because this was an unpaid gig, etc. We actually invited, I invited basically 19 of my colleagues to not write articles, peer review articles, but to insert their presence through one-page statements on their curatorial practice. And in this case, in this instance, we were able to insert the voices. In fact, it actually is a special insert of this journal of BIPOC voices who would otherwise not be represented in that issue for all different kinds of systemic racist reasons, right? So I am in fact really in deliberations and quite frustrated this morning because I am in the middle of canceling a trip to Ottawa to open a show that I and many other BIPOC Mark, if you could please turn mute, thank you. So I and other BIPOC artists, curators have invited artists to be in a group exhibition, which you see here. The image for the project is actually by the artist that I selected, Marigold Santos. And so this is a mural work that you'll see in the gallery. It is expected to open tomorrow. Apart from feeling under the weather for the last few days, I actually officially canceled just now because of the situation that is going to be in Ottawa this weekend today, which is the first anniversary of what they call the Freedom Convoy, which was very present in Ottawa at this time, in fact, this day last year, and ended up basically stalling and stopping Ottawa in its tracks with this protest that lasted for over 3 weeks in the city. And so you see an image from last year's protests and an image from yesterday for the city, who's getting ready to expect over 5,000 repeat attendees from last year's to voice their grievances against COVID measures against the trucking industry, certainly, but also many of the constituents here are card carrying known people to be part of the alt-right and white supremacist groups. And so they're going to be very vocal. And I showed this particular picture because this is up the street from my hotel that was booked for me. And I am unwilling to put myself in that kind of situation. As you know, that there were many, there was a huge impact on BIPOC folks during that time, in addition to the anti-violence, anti-Asian violence and racism against Asians in particular during the time of COVID and even until now. And we can mark also the incidents, the tragic incidents from LA this past week that complicates the ways in which the BIPOC communities are affected by wide-ranging systemic racism. So as mentioned previously, I was an ethnocultural art histories research chair at my university, and that really is the culmination of over a decade or more of cultural organizing, particularly through a student-driven group that I founded about in 2011 called Echelon Cultural Art Histories Research Group. And you can see from the Instagram capture that I have here, then the wide range of projects that we did over the years. And in a way, this was such a necessary project for in the 2000s, just because there was such a lack of programming curriculum that would reflect the growing diversity of the student body, in terms of cultural diversity, but also gender diversity. And so I think that this project, which is about 12, 13 years old, was at that time really important to add to programming that wasn't existing in the university for students who wanted to see themselves represented in the activities and events that were organized by the university. And so we ended up doing it ourselves. And it's only recently, literally only like the last couple of years, where I've been able to obtain institutional support to actually pay students to work on organizing these events. And so this is something that needs to change, that needs to be scrutinized, because in a sense, the 10 years, if I'm currently writing now the institutional history of EAR and how it has been, in fact, since it's been over 10 years, 1/5 of Concordia University, where I teach Concordia University's history of existence, right? But 1/5 of that existence for EAR has been volunteer work. And we've organized over 100 activities, including international and national conferences on a volunteer basis. And so I think that's really important for the university to remark upon and to change gears, because this cannot continue. This kind of attitude cannot continue. I think previously, before we sort of turned a blind eye onto unpaid internships, unpaid things, unpaid student work, but now as the times are changing, and we should be making those changes. So a call to action there. I find it very hard to speak about my own trajectory in many ways, which is why you found me reading my story. But one way that I was able to revisit this, to revisit my own family's pathway, a migration path to Canada, in a sense, is through actually the work of my very dear friend and colleague and artist, Karen Tam, who's some of her projects you can see here. And I've been writing about her work. I've also been curating her work for a long time, since she just graduated from the Institute of Chicago. And Karen, like me, is also born in Montreal and raised here, and still lives and works here, which is really an important aspect of the Asian diaspora community here. That there are not that many who are of my generation who were actually born in Montreal. So when I think back to, for example, my classes in primary school and secondary school, I would often be the only visible minority, literally, no Indigenous peoples at that point in any given cohort of a year. Right. So that's how distinct it was. And one thing that, yes, the situation has changed enormously. As I show you some more images of the work that Karen has been doing. If we think that things have changed drastically, I would say it's relatively speaking, because I was at a recruitment and graduate event last night with students and faculty, and really just sharing research, very similar to today's setting. And indeed, there were only 2 visible minorities in the room of 40 of this. And so does it make you uncomfortable? Yes, it still does, right? Because it's myself and a Black student who is also at Concordia, studying at Concordia. So I think that this is a really important reflection on the demographics, and not just the histories of Canada, but and the Americas, but also locally in Montreal, and how it's affecting my field in art history. And I mention this because Karen's work is particularly of interest to me, because her work so closely thinks through the contexts of the lived experiences of Asian diaspora communities in Montreal and Quebec, right? And so this project, which was one of her first projects that she introduced to the contemporary art world, is her restaurant series, which basically consists of recreating restaurants, Chinese restaurants of a particular style in the 50s and 60s that was self-orientalizing in the galleries. And so this is one of the restaurants that she initiated in Vancouver, which I curated as a group show. And you can see she turned the front of the gallery and the inside into what looks like a restaurant, a Chinese restaurant. And you can ask for a menu and you can get the menu, but on the menu is no food. It just actually describes and informs you, instructs you, educates you about how spring rolls are actually not a common food fare in Asia, but was made for white Canadian consumption in this context. And this is actually called a wishing tree. I'm sure it's called something else, but Karen made a wishing tree in a space in Chinatown in Montreal. And I wanted to bring this in because Karen's work is very much tied to Chinatown, the Chinatowns where she stages her installation works. And this is such an important part of her contribution because of the precarious nation and precarious situation of so many Chinatowns all across the Americas. And in Canada, we have a diminishing number of them over time. And in fact, Chinatown's own, Montreal's own Chinatown, the only Francophone one in Canada, was also at a very precarious point in its history of being obliterated altogether through the activities of developers, real estate developers, and also just the ongoing gentrification. And it's not until last year that Chinatown in Montreal was actually declared a cultural heritage neighborhood, and therefore protected up to a certain point from further development. And this is an important part of it. And I also want to acknowledge that in the audience, Janet Blum. Hi, Janet. Thank you so much for being here, who is one of our elders in Montreal. So much part of this history of activism and cultural organization to showcase the contributions of our Asian communities in Montreal and in Canada. So thank you, Janet. So to go on, how much time do I have? I have like lost track of the clock.
About 5 minutes.
5 minutes? Oh, that's great. Okay, so the next part is to show another project and how Karen Tam's work and mine are coinciding, and how it seems natural for us to be working together. It's almost organic. This is another type of what Karen calls ethnic spaces that she recreates in the gallery. And this is, if you look at it quickly, it indeed looks like a curiosity shop that sells trinkets, Orientalist trinkets, but also Chinaware, tourist art items that are of what you would categorize of the chinoiserie type, all things Chinese. But indeed, this is actually the front of a gallery, in this one is in Plymouth. As you see here, where the front of the gallery has been transformed into a curio shop, and you might actually step in thinking that, oh, you might want to buy a trinket or two. And this is what you might encounter in one of her installations for the curiosity shops. So what you see here are things that you expect to be in a curiosity shop, but when you look closely, you realize, and it's actually really obvious when you look closely, that some of the items are recreated by the artist by very sort of easy to find materials. And so an obvious, I tried to choose obvious ones. So there you see the jade color kind of vase next to another sort of what you could buy in a dollar store, right? Like an item that is similar, but the ones that the artist made are made out of soap, or they're made out of papier mâché. So it's really obvious, like you can really tell from the vases. So she's put these fake chinoiserie items next to chinoiserie, which, you know, by definition is sort of a fakery of the real, what would be a really very valuable item. To the left, oops, no, not to the right bottom corner, you see a vase that's made out of, I'm gonna reveal the secret, it's made out of foam balls, and it's covered up by sequins. And the mythology, it looks like at first glance a very expensive ancient dynasty vase, but it's actually made out of sequins. And the motifs are invented by Karen Tam herself through narratives that she reads. And so sometimes there are motifs that are the imitations of motifs that she'll find in actual older dynastic vases and chinoiserie items. But sometimes you will find things like drone planes, you know, drone machines, items that just stick out, airplanes that stick out that is of our time. All right, so she really mixes them up, and this kind of interest in the object and the histories of how these objects gain value and end up in museums, right, is something that I'm also interested in learning, but also thinking of critical ways in which we can approach how we teach about these items that do not end up reiterating stereotypical interpretations of not only the cultures where they came from, but also these objects in themselves and their value in the museum. And so what's important about Karen Tam's contemporary artworks, and here are a set that she's made in the way that I described, that actually has been acquired by the Montreal Museum of Art and is displayed next to some of their very valuable treasures from the dynastic ages in their what they call Arts of One World Gallery. It's their global art galleries of everything non-Western that's put in these galleries. And so you see very ancient piece next to the old, to what are basically contemporary artworks that are in conversation with these pieces. And this allows the museum to actually bring, to reactivate conversations in a more critical way for audiences, right? Because it pulls them out and goes, oh, wait a second, but why is there such a relationship? Why have these objects been so valued and collected by European collectors? Meanwhile, you have this entire very tragic, sad history of Asian indenturement, indentured servitude through the so-called coolie system, the histories of Asian Canadians and also Indigenous people working on the most dangerous sections of building Canada's and the US's railroads. You know, you have all these histories of the treatment of of Canada, in this case, the state of the peoples in such a demeaning way, whereas these objects that they produce are immortalized and just, you know, put on pedestals, literally. And so this sort of aligns with what I am working on right now, which I took point to what Livia was saying, how critical race under the Trump administration has just suffered such an enormous setback, being sort of banned, to put it bluntly, from curriculum from curriculum in universities, which is just tragic. And meanwhile, at the same time, there is an urgency to address these issues in the field that I'm working in, which is curatorial studies and museum studies, or museology. And there is, in fact, a project that I've been involved in with thinking through the museum, a large grant project that's across Canada, where one of our clusters is actually called Critical Race Museology. And it's about speaking to speaking back basically to how critical race theory could be very important for museum studies at this, before also, but at this particular time when museums, institutions, also academies, universities are very consciously and cautiously embarking on huge EDI programs, right? So I think that this is a crucial point in time. So you almost get this kind of ironic coexistence, and I would not call it an impasse anymore. I think really that we're going ahead with this kind of study because we really need it, right? So the idea that I'm looking at, and I'm working with Laura and one of my PhD students. You see here, Laura Vigo is the curator of Asian Arts at the Museum of Fine Arts in Montreal. In the middle is Karen Tam, and on the side, this side is Ryan Rice, who is also a Indigenous curator from Montreal, in conversation about one of Karen's installations. But importantly, also this was a conversation that was part of a conference that I had organized that looks at Asian and Indigenous relationalities in contemporary art, and how racialized settlers engage in decolonial practices within the museum context. And so Ryan was there to talk about that. There's a story behind that too. With Karen's work, I'm going to continue looking at this through the objects. And in fact, what students are asked to do is take an object from the collection that is very closely or somehow reminds them or is connected to their own research projects, and think about how this object came to be in the collection. And what are all the preconceived ideas about this particular object that might have implications on the ways in which they are going to examine their own research projects. And in this way, instilling a self-reflexivity that's part of the process of engaging with public sort of changing and challenging mainstream public knowledges about certain objects and yeah, affecting change in that way. So I'm going to stop here. Thank you, everyone.